Thanks for joining us here on 9 News on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube page and streaming on Watch. I'm Meteorologist Chris Bianchi, and yes, we're going to get into some pretty good detail here on yesterday's iconic landspout tornado that we saw over southwestern Weld County. We did see some preliminary reports of some damage. The National Weather Service is actually out right now reviewing some of that damage to determine the rating scale, or essentially how strong that tornado was. But I know a lot of you probably have some questions, understandably, about we keep talking about a landspout tornado. What is a landspout tornado? That's one of the reasons I'm here. Another one of them is to answer some other questions that you might have about what led to this, and maybe even, and totally understandable if you have this question about it, is it really wasn't forecast. These kinds of landspout tornadoes, let's just start with the very basics of it, and we're going to actually take a look at the landspout here in just a few minutes from Sky 9 and the view that we had over that from yesterday's tornado. This forms from the ground up. That's the first thing, and there you can see it there on Sky 9. This tornado forms from the ground up. Now, a traditional tornado, think about a Wizard of Oz tornado or a Twister tornado, the ones you see over the plains, those form from the cloud down to the ground. This one goes from the ground up. That's the first kind of basic difference, but the real main point of the landspout tornado, the reason why we keep calling it that, is the way it forms is totally different from the ones that, again, we're talking about, say, in the plains, those, again, Wizard of Oz, those more iconic or more traditional tornadoes, so to speak. These form due to colliding air boundaries. And the best way I can think to describe this is, think about taking a piece of paper, right? Something like this. In order for it to stay up, you would need to have a fan on this side and a fan on this side, and then next thing you know, you'd have this little piece of paper kind of wiggling up there. That's the way that this tornado that you're looking at, that's essentially how it formed yesterday. Now, there are so many different things about yesterday's tornado that really stand out, but first and foremost, this was on the ground for about half an hour. Now, when we get a landspout tornado like the one that you're looking at, these will usually last roughly between 5 and 10 minutes, because again, you're getting colliding air boundaries, and think about that same paper analogy, you have to have both of those wind boundaries colliding at the exact right angle, at the exact point, at the exact wind speed in order for those to maintain this, right? So it's a really difficult process. It's a very kind of random happenstance. While, again, those more traditional tornadoes you see on the plains, those have a bit more of a less of a random component to them. But when we're talking about wind specifically, or colliding wind boundaries like the ones that led to yesterday's tornado, you do have a bit of a random component to it. Basically, any day that we do have colliding winds, usually from thunderstorms, those can lead to the possibility for a landspout tornado. By the way, here in Colorado, we're really, really prone to getting these landspout tornadoes. In fact, a lot of storm chasers will call Colorado, a little affectionately, the landspout capital of the United States, and perhaps the landspout capital of the world. And the reason why, well, step outside, you're probably looking at mountains, right? You got the Rockies, of course. You even got more subtle terrain differences. You've got the Palmer Divide, the Palmer Ridge, just south of the Denver metro area. And then just north of Denver, you've also got the Cheyenne Ridge. So you've got all these little kind of subtle terrain differences. And when you get those little subtle terrain differences, you get these different winds. And so essentially, you're getting all these colliding winds all the time, but it takes the perfect wind at the perfect angle to create what you saw yesterday. And in particular, when it comes to yesterday's tornado, again, you've got to have that at the exact right angle for it to happen. Now, more specifics and more details about yesterday's storm. And again, I know I'm seeing some questions already about the exact rating and what led to it. And by the way, if you do have a question, please write it below, and I'll try and get to your question as well. When it comes to yesterday's tornado specifically, the exact meteorological lead up to it was to the south of town. If you're watching or watching us here from, say, Castle Rock or Douglas County or even western Elbert County, you probably had a little storm yesterday, right? Well, anytime you get a thunderstorm, you get these cool winds. It's called an outflow boundary, or a little cool, cold pool of air that rushes out from the storm, right? You know, think about it, any average summertime thunderstorm, you get that nice little cool breeze out ahead of that storm. That cool breeze is that little wind boundary, and that led into this storm as it was developing, and that forced it kind of go on up. And as that storm was starting to develop, that's when you saw this landspout tornado. And also, by the way, another thing about landspouts is that they usually will develop at the front end of the storm. So as a storm is starting to develop, you're getting these updraft winds. You're getting kind of these winds ingesting all their energy and forcing it to go up in the first place. And that's what leads, and that's usually the phase of the storm where you'll see these landspout tornadoes develop. So again, the basic bullet points about these landspouts is they're extremely random, they're caused by colliding wind boundaries, and they're exceptionally difficult to forecast. I know there are some efforts ongoing to try and better predict them, but because of the fact that they're caused by randomly colliding wind boundaries that are based on an exact geographic specification, it's very difficult to get a bit of an accurate forecast about them. So hopefully it gives you a bit of a summary here about what exactly led to yesterday's tornado, why also it was so kind of difficult to forecast ahead of time, and also letting you know that these tend to happen in Colorado a lot. Again, that is based due in large part to our terrain differences. We've got such different terrain. You get into far eastern Colorado, Burlington, Flagler, Stratton, there on far eastern Colorado along I-70, you're looking at an elevation about 4,000, 4,500 feet, and that gradually goes on up as you get closer and closer to Denver. So you're getting this little upslope difference, and then those subtle terrain differences as well, like the Palmer Divide and the Cheyenne Ridge, and then of course you got the mighty Rocky Mountains that lie just to our west. You probably didn't need me to tell you that. So a lot of different things that lead to that difference there in terrain. So I'm going to go through here, see if you've got any comments or questions. So seeing here, why wasn't this forecast? Yes, I know, Ashton, it is a good question. I know we've heard a lot about this. Again, the reason that these form is you're getting these colliding wind boundaries. So the best analogy, and I mentioned this at the beginning, if you're just joining us, is you got this little piece of paper and you got a fan on either side of it, and that's what's keeping that piece of paper floating up in the air, right? That's the best way to kind of think about it. It's very difficult, and you've got to have that wind at the exact right direction, at the exact speed to maintain this. And yesterday's landspout, the one that you're looking at, I mean, my goodness, this thing was on the ground for half an hour, and also it only appears to have tracked for about 5 miles. So this thing was just crawling. This was moving at about 10 miles an hour as it tracked through southwestern Weld County. So again, that's an exceptionally slow rate of speed. For example, if you're talking about a tornado, a more traditional one in the plains or in the southern United States, those will usually move between about 40 and 60 miles an hour, give or take. But this one yesterday was moving at just 10 miles an hour. This thing was just crawling along as it was moving through southern Weld County. So this tornado that you saw yesterday, again, exceedingly random. I can tell you firsthand here that when I saw the tornado warning initially, I was kind of taken aback. I said, I did not think there was any chance for a tornado. And sometimes you can get conditions that are a bit more favorable for landspouts. Yesterday's didn't appear to have a lot of those dynamics in place. In fact, this was the only landspout tornado that appeared to take place in all of eastern Colorado yesterday. Another thing about landspouts is that often you'll get multiple funnels within them because they're riding one big boundary. So sometimes you'll see 2 or 3 funnels within a little landspout boundary, and that was not the case with yesterday's tornado. So again, a lot of pretty interesting components to what we saw from yesterday's tornado. So that's it for us here on the Facebook side of things. We're going to switch things over. If you want to continue the conversation, we're going to switch things over to our 9 News YouTube page, as well as on our watch pages, and also at 9news.com/watch. So if you got a streaming app, Roku, Amazon Fire, join us there. We'll continue the conversation, but we're going to log off Facebook for now. But again, continuing what we're talking about with yesterday's tornado. So no rating yet from the National Weather Service. They're out there now. What happens after a tornado like the one we saw yesterday is the Weather Service will go out there and take a look at the damage. First of all, to confirm that a tornado actually took place, but as you can see there, that is pretty much confirmed at this point that we obviously saw a tornado out there in southern Weld County. What the Weather Service is now going to do is they're going to take a look at the damage to try and get a gauge for the exact wind speed that accompanied yesterday's tornado. So that's a bit more of a difficult and nuanced process than you might think of it. You have to take a look at whether you're talking about what kind of structures, A, were hit by it, B, what kind of damage was inflicted on those buildings and see what kind of rotation took place as well. So there's a lot of different things that kind of go into whether or not or what kind of rating that this tornado will get. I will say this, Corey Reppenhagen, meteorologist Corey Reppenhagen, my colleague, we were talking about this morning a little bit. We wouldn't be surprised this would be an EF2, which is a stronger tornado. And when we're talking about landspouts, they're usually weaker, they're short-lived. Yesterday's, I mentioned this earlier on, this lasted half an hour, and this one appeared to inflict some pretty significant damage out there in southern Weld County. So again, wouldn't be surprised you saw an EF2, and that is so rare when we're talking about a landspout tornado. Normally, again, we're talking about an EF0, a low-end EF1, with wind speeds perhaps between 70 and 100 miles an hour. That's nothing to laugh at. If you've ever been in a 70 mile an hour wind, that's a pretty serious wind gust, right? But yesterday's tornado, I wouldn't be surprised we were talking about wind speeds there at 120 plus miles an hour. This is unconfirmed. I'm just basing this off of some of the damage reports that we've seen, but the National Weather Service will have that rating into us probably later on today, maybe a preliminary rating, maybe early tomorrow, depending on how much more damage they have to look at. But again, giving you an idea in terms of what we've seen from this tornado. I know I'm seeing quite a few questions about whether or not this has been rated yet. The quick answer is no, it hasn't, and B, wouldn't be too shocked if we're talking about a tornado here that gets a rating of an EF2, which is so rare with this landspout tornado. And for the final time, I'm going to explain what a landspout tornado is, because I keep seeing those questions, and I totally understand it, because this is really the only part of the country, one of the few parts of the country that regularly gets landspout tornadoes. Another analogy, by the way, for a landspout, if you've ever seen a waterspout or heard of a waterspout, the way that those typically form is very similar to the way that landspout tornadoes form. You're getting colliding wind boundaries, and that means that the tornado forms from the ground going on up, rather than a traditional tornado, 80-90% of tornadoes, which form from the cloud base down to the ground. But again, a landspout tornado, ground up, totally different way of forming from a regular tornado, a very random way of forming, because you've got to get these exact parameters, these exact winds at the exact right angles to form at the precise point for these to go on up. So again, this was perhaps just as much of a surprise to me as a meteorologist. I've been in Denver for 11 years. I was shocked when I saw this yesterday. I couldn't believe it initially. So for a lot of us, yeah, this was certainly a bit of a surprise as well. And usually when we're talking about landspouts, they tend to be weaker, they tend to be shorter lived. Yesterday's on the ground for half an hour. Normally a landspout won't last more than 10 minutes. So a lot of things that kind of stood out about yesterday's tornado, I found it to be pretty interesting. I know we did see some damage, and certainly think about those that did suffer some of that damage out there in southern parts of Weld County, but fortunately no reports of any injuries at this point. That is certainly some good news. And by the way, if you are in the path of a landspout tornado, yes, I'm saying these tend to be weaker and shorter-lived tornadoes, but that doesn't mean you can't take these seriously. I mean, again, we saw a fair bit of damage from yesterday's tornado, and if somebody was in the path of this, they could have been seriously hurt or perhaps killed by this if you don't take those exact precautions. And just as a reminder, we are getting into that time of year where we see landspout and regular supercell thunderstorm tornadoes in eastern Colorado. What to do if you're in the event of a tornado. You get in that innermost room that's usually, ideally, a basement. If not, you're talking about a cedar closet, an inner bathroom, and the general rule of thumb, lowest floor, as many windows or as many walls between yourself and the outside as possible. So hopefully this is all giving you a little bit of added insight about yesterday's tornado, which was certainly something. And thanks for joining us here on 9 News Watch, as well as on our 9 News YouTube page. I'm meteorologist Chris Bianchi. We'll certainly have more of this coming on up.